different in this. So in this book, the what I'm trying to do is that the book is divided into two parts. The first part is called political narratives, where I'm trying to engage with the Euro-American academic political theory. And in the second part, which is called South Asian narratives, that part is where the South Asian context is very much present. So this is something which I am doing. Now, the book is on the political narratives and South Asian counter narratives. The book has two parts. Part one is called political narratives, comprising of a brief introduction and 5 core chapters. Part two is called South Asian counter narratives with another 5 chapters. The book presents two visions of the growth and development of capitalism and the promise of an alternative to capitalism. In this regard, this book also presents a counter narrative to such ambitious goals of Western political theory that once thought that either global capitalism or socialism, along with secularism, will jointly march forward to champion the cause of human progress by analyzing the growth of majoritarian nationalism, right-wing populism, and communal fascism at a time of monumental decline of the left in India. The political narratives of the 19th and 20th centuries regarding capitalism, socialism, and justice were called into question by the emergence of global public protests in the first decade of the 21st century in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis of global financial capitalism. In contrast to the large canvas of Euro-American political narratives that had some universal appeals like emancipation and justice, the South Asian counter-narratives are taken into account in this book with reference to how the South Asian region in general and India in particular have responded to such grand meta-narratives of capitalism, socialism, and justice. In this respect, a different trajectory of majoritarian nationalism and right-wing populism in India has been theorized along with the decline of the Indian left, while looking at the possibilities of a new radical democratic politics that could counter the reactionary majoritarian nationalism and right-wing populism in India. In this regard, one can evaluate the promise of the grand political and philosophical narratives of the 19th and 20th centuries about human progress in the context of the fast-changing 21st century. The 19th century major philosophers, ranging from John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx to Friedrich Nietzsche, did talk about a secular future. There was huge optimism about eradicating human miseries by addressing the issues of income and employment, alongside curing several diseases with developments in the field of medicine for significant populations in the world in the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War. Now, you have to understand that my book's target is very much specific. It is a book which is directly talking to those or to those audience who have a basic understanding or at least basic knowledge about key texts of Western political theories, and to some extent also psychoanalysis of Freud and Lacan in some of the chapters that I have also used. The post-war condition in the 20th century did progress to a great extent with newly independent states with secular constitutions during the middle decades of what can be seen as an important phase of global decolonization. However, by the end of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of global religious nationalism were noticed alongside the rise of global inequality and unemployment. A significant growth of religious and majoritarian nationalisms came about with a protracted economic slowdown and recession in many countries following the 2008-9 global financial crisis. The political field is now open for various possibilities. The emergence of right-wing populism with xenophobic rhetoric, majoritarian religious nationalism, spontaneous public protests, and new left governments with left-wing populist policies. Contrary to Francis Fukuyama's global prophecy of a Victorian liberal democracy in the wake of the fall of Soviet socialism, India had regressively turned from a post-colonial populist democracy in the 1990s to an authoritarian and majoritarian nationalist country by the second decade of the 21st century. Looking at India from the concerns of political theory in the 19th century, one can say that while the liberal thinker John Stuart Mill's wish fulfillment about liberty of the individual and government by consultation had disastrously failed to flourish on Indian soil under a majoritarian nationalist regime, the Marxian goal of proletarian revolution never became a reality either. Moreover, Nietzsche's claim of the demise of God seems to be a false claim in the eyes of the Indian masses. By the end of the 20th century, religion and gods became powerful forces to galvanize masses for political power in India. Such failures of Mill, Marx, and Nietzsche's dreams were also witnessed in the rest of South Asia. In this respect, the book will engage with the so-called universality of the grand political narratives of Euro-American political theory about justice, capitalism, and protest by contraposing the particularities of South Asian counter-narratives in the context of the rise of authoritarianism, majoritarian nationalism, and the decline of the 20th century communist left. In other words, it will narrate how things went wrong with the South Asian region in general and India in particular on the issues of secularism and distributive justice, even though the region held a glorious anti-colonial struggle with the vision of a secular future and a secular constitution and the decolonial promise of eradicating human miseries of the Indian people. After 7 decades of the Indian Republic, India is witnessing massive socio-economic inequalities and an utterly regressive form of religious majoritarian nationalism that is exclusive in its political orientation. In this respect, the book will also highlight alternative forms of progressive visions to the existing models of capitalism and governmental forms of authoritarianism and majoritarian nationalism. In effect, it will point to the possibilities of a radical democratic future by looking at some of the progressive trends in India and discussing how such political counter narratives could be emulated in resisting the existing forms of authoritarianism and majoritarian nationalism. In reading this book, the reader must be clear that while liberalism right from the days of Mill was concerned with the individual and normative idea of rights, Marxism from the days of Marx and Engels was concerned with class. In contrast to both liberalism and Marxism, this author, which is myself, takes insights from the post-Marxist tradition in which demand is the focal point of politics in the everyday and politics of the future. Thus, any imaginary of a post-capitalist alternative and an assessment of South Asian politics is considered from the contesting demands that have been articulated in the political sphere. In this respect, the post-Marxist tradition does not ignore the merits within the Marxian epistemological corpus, but elaborates it with some necessary theoretical modifications for imagining and doing politics in the 21st century. As Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, the two prominent theoreticians of the post-Marxist school, quite convincingly argue that by clearly locating themselves in a post-Marxist terrain, they not only help to clarify the meaning of contemporary social struggles, but also give to Marxism its theoretical dignity, which can only proceed from recognition of its limitations and of its historicality. Only through such recognition will Marx's work remain present in our tradition and our political culture. This is where Laclau and Mouffe basically argued that in a paper called Post-Marxism Without Apologies in 1987, there was a debate with Norman Jarvis, and particularly with the issue of how they have moved out of Marxism. So this particular chapter was incorporated Laclau's new reflections on the revolution of our time in 1990. In terms of concrete engagement with the Latin American theorists like Laclau, my humble submission is that his works have a lot to offer to the Indian left and progressive forces. And by progressive forces in India, I have clarified in this book, is that I consider a lot of regional parties with federalist tendencies as progressive force. Also the Indian left, which is kind of there in Kerala, but they have like their base has shrinked in both Tripura and Bengal, but they are in Kerala. You have Trinamool, you have AAP, and several other regional forces who are more into federalist kind of an orientation they have, and of course the Ambedkar, so that's the broad bandwagon of progressive forces. So it basically, so Laclau's works has a lot to offer for the Indian left and progressive force in looking at how fascism and populism mobilize people in advanced industrial economies in Europe and in the peasant economies of Latin America. Such lessons are necessary to fight the fascists and populace in India. The Indian left was once a populist force in the 20th century. By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the Indian left was facing tremendous crisis in terms of political mobilization in their erstwhile political bastions, thanks to the rise of both center-left regional populism and right-wing populism, and partly because of the communist left's lethargy to update the political and ideological vocabulary suitable to the new issues and the new generation of the 21st century. Indian left, liberals, and center left regional populists, together constituted as a broad spectrum of Indian progressives, can learn much from the Latin American experience and the call of socialism of the 21st century because of the many similarities between India and the peasant economies of Latin America. Uneven industrial development, the presence of urban lumpen proletariat, and representative democracy. However, there is one fundamental difference between Latin America and India. In the latter case, which is in the Indian case, the pedagogic language of communication with the masses as well as with party workers or party organizers is mostly in English and regional languages, unlike in Latin America. In some assessments by the Indian left and other progressives, there has been a temptation to emulate the transitional economy of China, where a large peasant economy has been undergoing massive transformation towards industrialization and urbanization. But the will to become China has an impediment. Unlike China, in most of South Asia in general, and India in particular, the political system of representative democracy has put constraints on political leaders to negotiate with various groups and individuals for a rapid transformation towards industrialization, urbanization, and modernization. In this respect, in order to move towards a progressive future in South Asia in general and India in particular, there is a need to search for concrete policies of eradicating poverty, inequality, and unemployment by identifying how similar peasant economies with multi-party democracies have advanced without dismantling the broad secular fabric that is necessary for retaining peace and order within the nation states forming the broad region of South Asia. Now, in chapter 1, which is called Elusiveness and Necessity of Justice, a political exposition, it deals with the normative idea of justice that has been debated through the long tradition of political philosophy. And I have engaged with particularly the liberal tradition in the contemporary 20th century, particularly in the Euro-American academy. So Rawls, Nozick, Sandel, and then you have a Marxist response, particularly from Jerry Cohen, and then engage with Amartya Sen, and then I come with the post-Marxist approach of how to look at justice as a concept. So, since the ideas of justice and injustice have been contested from varied ideological positions, and there is hardly any conclusive, comprehensive, and consensual theory of justice, it is only fair to say that there will likely never be an adequate theory of justice. Thus, justice as a value is not merely relative and related to other normative concepts. Instead, it is profoundly elusive. However, if it is elusive, then why is it so often evoked in various political and philosophical discourses across time? This chapter will argue that justice as a normative political ideal is necessary for any political discourse to justify its goals and actions. Amartya Sen, in his recent work on political philosophy, incisively demonstrates that the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century do not show a fundamental break from the general trend of disagreement on the very meaning of justice as one finds in the European Enlightenment tradition or the ancient and medieval period in both East and West. And of course, you are quite aware that Sen's book, The Idea of Justice in 2009, and he of course discussed this between two schools, transcendental institutionalism and realization-focused comparativism. And he places himself in the realization-focused comparativism along with a lot of liberal thinkers and also Marx. So we'll come to that later, maybe while discussing the issue. Liberal Marxist literature are preoccupied with the distributive question in matters of justice. Here, the post-Marxist position will be the following. Instead of a fully reconciled and harmonious society of market liberalism and communism, other antagonisms of race, gender, and environment might be still unresolved. Thus, with communism, there need not necessarily be an end of politics. And we do political philosophy not thinking about only in the immediate future. It's not like say tomorrow, so communism is already dead. So tomorrow, whether it is actually relevant or not, that's not what political philosophy does. It thinks about much later. So maybe what will happen in another 50 years, and what will happen in another 1800 years, right? So this is something which, of course, the long tradition of political philosophy think like that. Therefore, the left must address both the questions of redistribution and recognition. In this respect, a fruitful political intellectual task is to give primacy to politics, identify the antagonistic moments that are constitutive of human societies, and initiate various forms of hegemonic political struggles. Indeed, such political struggles can be possible only in the name of justice, even if that is elusive. So you need justice. Otherwise, how do you mobilize? So this is something which the post-Marxists will basically argue. So the normative concepts like equality, justice, democracy, these are actually contentless. Doesn't mean anything. In the post-Marxist tradition, we can call them such as empty signifiers. But this is very necessary. Otherwise, why people will be mobilized, right? And from different positions, the contents of justice, equality, liberty, democracy will vary. The meanings will vary. So the socialist interpretation of what is justice will be very different from how the liberals look at justice, or how the fascists will look at justice, or how the religious fundamentalists will look at justice, right? So my point is that philosophers have offered, and in kind of paraphrasing Marx's 11th thesis, my point is that philosophers have offered only various ideas of justice. The point is that they are not truths, but necessary for politics and mobilization. Chapter 2, Avatar, which is a film, a Hollywood film, which I kind of interpreted. So chapter 2, Avatar, a political cinema, is argued that the Hollywood blockbuster Avatar, which is again got released in 2009, and it was directed by James Cameron. It reflects various issues associated with the project of extractive capitalism and contemporary imperialism. After briefly analyzing Cameron's filmography, I proceed to argue the strengths and weaknesses of the film in providing a critique of modern imperialism. Secondly, the theme of Freud's totemic society and the right to life under a non-capitalist mode of production is reflected in the film. Thirdly, the film is a critique of various forms of accumulation of capital and war on terror. Fourthly, it shows the possibility of successful anti-imperialist resistance by the colonized subjects, even with technological weaknesses. Fifthly, the film shows the problem of ecological crisis. Sixthly, it problematically celebrates hero worship rather than emphasizing collective resistance to imperialism. And finally, the chapter argues that the film represents the liberal American guilt in the aftermath of 9/11, the Iraq War, and Hurricane Katrina in the context of contemporary American politics. Here in this chapter, I also developed what a concept called combined accumulation of capital, which is different from the Marxist primitive accumulation of capital. So in the primitive accumulation of capital, there is the process of coercion, whereas I'm arguing that in the combined accumulation of capital, both coercion and consent are both there. So capital needs land, and in this case, they need this planet, which is Pandora. They go there. So US with US Army and the US corporate giants, they go there. So it will be like kind of a mining thing. But they also at the same time negotiating with the indigenous population. They offer money, they kind of compensation, and the element of compensation is something with the libertarians will argue that it is not coercion because we are giving you money. So there is a kind of consent. So basically, it's a combined accumulation of capital. I'm kind of arguing that it's a combination of both coercion and transaction, which is different from the primitive accumulation of capital. Of course, this idea is not that developed in this chapter, but I've kind of highlighted this in this chapter. Maybe in the long run, I will develop the very idea of the combined accumulation of capital. So I need some time, but in this chapter, this particular idea is there. Chapter 3, Theology and Ideology, Political Reading of Islamic Discourses, is concerned with private versus public, interrogatory and innovative reading of Islamic discourses. It precisely argues the dimensions and boundaries of politics and religion seem to be fuzzy and artificial, as the Western modernist enlightenment tried to bifurcate between church and the state or politics. It further points out that as far as the political dimensions of religion in general and the case of Islam in particular are concerned, The very notion of organized religion in general and Islam in particular is essentially political. In other words, the possibilities and potentialities of the political are very much embedded within organized religions. Thus, to ignore the political identity of religion and to distinguish between religion and politics by equating religion with the private sphere and politics with the public sphere is therefore a futile task and a continuation of the false construct of the mainstream of the Western Enlightenment. The project of the European Enlightenment that separates between religion and politics has shown its limits with the return of religion to haunt the political spheres of modern Western countries and indeed contemporary Muslim society. So if religion exists in society, then the possibilities of the political challenge of religion exist as well. To locate such political dimensions of Islam and the politics within Islamic traditions and history, this chapter will take refuge in some children's stories from the Quran and writings on theology and history of Islam in order to deconstruct the personal faith-based religion of Islam. And here I basically my major sources are these children's stories from the Quran, and the approaches are one is that of the reading the Islamic discourses from the psychoanalytical viewpoint of Freud and Lacan, and and also to read how the Islamic historians, historians of the Islamic, particularly the 7th, 8th century Islamic world, that kind of history I'm also reading, kind of a very innovative kind of an imaginary kind of a reading. Now, chapter 4, the promise of alternative transforming capitalism, it discusses how the nature of capitalism has transformed from the 19th and 20th centuries into the 21st century. And several scholars within the two separate academic disciplines of political economy and political theory have become interested in thinking of social structure beyond capitalism and constructing an alternative system to capitalism. This chapter will follow this legacy of imagining an alternative to capitalism in the 21st century by evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of the extant scholarship on alternatives to capitalism. In effect, it will chart out the possibilities of an alternative by analyzing the inherent problems of contemporary capitalism in the 21st century. So here there is a lot of kind of ideas. So one idea that I can kind of also kind of provided is that of this, how capitalism will manifest surplus population. So today you have xenophobia and xenophobic mobilization, communal kind of a situation between one kind of section of population against the other. But eventually capitalism in the long run has to address the surplus population. So one idea that I kind of briefly engaged with is that one could think about future planetary inventions when if let's say in the long run Moon and Mars they become habitable in the long run. I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about 50 years from now, or 80 years from now, or 100 years from now. Whether this surplus population will actually be sent off to Moon and Mars. I mean, in that context, it will be like almost like the colonial situation, where the surplus population of the colonial countries were sent to the settler colonies, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, or North America. Whether that will be like that kind of a situation, and then who will go? The rich will go, or the poor will go. So you have to always incentivize if the habitations are better than world. So we know now Jeff Bezos and this the big corporate capitalists, they're trying their own space missions, and then already they're doing that. So maybe another 50 years, 80 years, 100 years, we don't know. But then the fundamental issue will be that who owns these planets. So you have outer space treaty, and so the idea of private property that Marx was the surplus population, probably there won't be any communism. But at the same time, these contradictions will be there. So this is something which kind of these ideas are kind of put are there in this chapter. Now, Chapter 5, Public Protest and Ethics of Dissent in Our Times, foregrounds two theoretical concepts of disagreement and dissensus as a starting point to understand public protest and political dissent. The chapter then analyzes the presence and absence of the public in public protest. After doing a brief historical survey, the chapter will look at two different kinds of public protest, namely leadership-centric movements and leaderless movements. So you have leadership, several movements which you have clearly see that there is a leader, iconic leader, cult figure. And then at the same time, you have several, spontaneous movements where you do not have any leaders. It's a faceless movements, leaderless movements. While pointing to the possibility of new public in the culture of protest. At the same time, the chapter will highlight the nature of contemporary global protest. The chapter will also narrate one form of public protest that are organized against individual political dissent. Finally, this chapter will deal with the presence of autonomy of public protest in our times, while locating the absence of hegemony of such public protests that helps to make an analytical distinction between movement and mobilization. So you have Occupy Wall Street or the Shahbag protests, or even today we have these Kisan movements which are going on. Now, some of the movements were actually sustained movements, right? So can actually sustain for a long period of time. But then because of the lack of hegemony, these movements go down. You see? Because you have horizontal kind of people coming from different sectors of the population on a particular issue. They do not have a proper cult figure leader, right? But then you have a kind of a mobilization which is there, but it is unable to achieve the demands. But the spontaneity is there. So this is the kind of these things that I've kind of explored. So this is basically the first part, which is called political narratives. Why I have called political narratives? It is very largely it's kind of linking with Western political theory, particularly in the Euro-American academy that I'm engaged with. Maybe there are some examples from South Asia, but I've largely engaged with the Euro-American political tradition. Then also the Islamic chapter of chapter 3 is also there. So how can we actually interpret these particular contexts, whether South Asia or in the Islamic world, and whether we can actually interpret those things from the Western political, the prism of the Western political theory. But chapter 6 onwards, which is part 2, is what I call South Asian counter narrative. Why I am saying South Asian counter narrative? This is precisely because in the first 5 chapters, the Western political theory's ambitious goals of justice, global democracy, or a kind of welfare capitalism, which was very much there in Rawls, and also that is something which is not coming to reality in the Indian context, right? So your Mill, Marx, Nietzsche talking about grand canvas of political theory, that those dreams are not being realized in chapter in the Indian context. So chapter 6 onwards is very much rooted in the South Asian context. So chapter 6 is called Dilemma of Muslim Belonging in Modern South Asia, where I basically addresses the question of Muslim identity and where does a Muslim belong, and the idea of the Muslim Ummah, which is an internationalist idea, with the idea of Watan or Mulk, which has more called home, so it's more kind of rootedness versus a cosmopolitan kind of belonging. And at the same time, you have this partition debates, and as I'm going through partition debates between Maududi, who was the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami and who was questioning both Jinnah as well as Azad's and Hussain Ahmad Madani's composite nationalism and Jinnah's Muslim nationalism. And he thinks that nationalism is something which is anti-Islamic, and how his positions also change over some time. And then by once Pakistan is created, within 2.5 decades, you have another split on the linguistic identity, and Bangladesh has been created. by 71. So where does a Muslim belong? This is interesting that there can be a kind of a belonging on the basis of a linguistic identity than that of a religious identity. And Bangladesh is the classic case in modern South Asia. This is where the chapter 6 I deal with chapter. In chapter 7, majority and nationalism in India, I basically make a difference between Bharatiya Janata Party, led National Democratic Alliance government in India, and the RSS. So I think that the RSS is a communal fascist organization, but BJP is a right-wing populist organization. We may debate it, but because the BJP has to fight elections, it has to compromise with certain ideological purity or certain kind of positions that the RSS holds, but then at the level of operation or political operation at the ground level, they have to kind of compromise. So a kind of populist tendency is there, which is of course right wing, which is definitely xenophobic, but this is a crucial difference that one has to make in order to understand what the situation is at the ground level. And of course, in the BJP in today's kind of Modi's kind of a regime, it is also kind of becoming authoritarian, and this authoritarianism is a kind of global trend. And if we interpret it from again a Western political theory kind of an approach, then one could say that globally this is a turn. Authoritarianism is a global trend, and it is a return of the Hobbesian state and the waning of the Lockean state. And in India, the Hobbesian state is being expressed to the cult of a right-wing populist leader. Chapter 8, called Right-Wing Populism and Political Rhetoric in Contemporary India, it examines particularly the political rhetoric of right-wing populism of both Modi and Amit Shah led Bharatiya Janata Party in contemporary India, and it basically deals with how they spoke on issues of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens in Assam, and how this rhetoric is somehow catching the imagination of a significant section of population. Of course, there is resistance on behalf of certain regional parties or by the left or by the Congress, but largely this has been kind of mobilizing on the basis of the right xenophobic kind of an agenda. It has mobilized quite a significant population in the northeastern state of Assam. Now, chapter 9, which is called Electoral Democracy and State Populism in India, it deals with state populism. Now, here I make a kind of an intervention to those whole Lucknow's argument. If you read Lucknow never makes a distinction between populism and politics. So, although we say that populist politics and all, for Lucknow, at least for Lucknow's kind of framework, there is no difference in populism and politics. Lucknow will say that any politics has to be populist, even if it has to make a significant political mobilization, it has to be populist, whether it's right or left. So that's not the issue. Now, but he makes a kind of a logic of what he calls the logic of difference and the logic of equivalence. Logic of equivalence is the quintessential logic of populism, which is directly connected to political mobilization of what he calls the people. Okay. The people is not just an empirical ensemble of certain persons, but at the same time, it's basically a kind of an ensemble of several demands, several unsatisfied democratic demands. Whereas in the another logic, which he calls the logic of difference, is basically the logic of the state. The state accommodates certain democratic demands. If the state can able to accommodate those demands, then that's the end of the matter, and the possibilities of politics ends there, right? So Lucknow has this two logic of difference and logic of equivalence. I am kind of intervening here. I'm saying that there is another logic, how at least in India, how things are going on. I don't know about, I'm not an expert in other countries, but at least in India, what is thing going on is that there's a third logic, is a logic of governance. Now, this logic of governance has a nuanced difference from the logic of difference. Why? Because in the logic of difference, Lucknow suggests that the democratic demands have to first expressed, right? And then the state can accommodate it. If the state cannot accommodate, then it will be unsatisfied democratic demand, and then there is a possibility for going towards the logic of equivalence. But suppose if the state, with their well-oiled machinery and bureaucracy, they preempts what the people demand. Suppose in Bengal today you have this kind of Lokhi Bhandar, which is 500 rupees for the general woman category of general woman, and 1,000 rupees for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe woman. Now this is a universal kind of basic income kind of a policy, but then nobody has actually mobilized for this demand. There was no huge movement for the demands. So it's unlike let's say unlike the Kisan movements where there's a specific demand, right? Let's scrap the law, scrap the three laws that have been passed. In these cases, and several similar schemes, you have Shastro Shati or several others kind of schemes which is there. So in the Indian case, suppose in the Modi's kind of a regime also, you have this whole Ujjala Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, then you have this whole Yojana of housing things and electricity, all these schemes, nobody is actually mobilized. So there was, before the articulation of any democratic demand, the state preempts it. So state preempts it and state kind of delivers it. So this is something which has a difference from the logic of difference. That's what I'm saying, that it is called a logic of governance. So in India, the state populism is actually possible because of the combination of all three logics. The logic of equivalence, through which a political party comes to political power, to the logic of difference, where it sustains its political power, and an additional logic of governance, through which not only it governs, but it actually sustains for a longer period of time. You see, it's not just 5 years and there is a change. It is through the logic of governance that it actually sustains for a longer range. This is something which I have explored in this chapter 9. And finally, in chapter 10, I discussed the organizational and political decline of the left. It's called Fortunes of Radicalism, Indian Maoists and the parliamentary left. And so today they're kind of a faulty understanding of how Indian neoliberal capitalism works, whether you are able to fight a very technologically superior neoliberal state. These are the issues that I kind of deal with it. And finally, I basically say that in this kind of a context where the left has declined, has been weakened, but we need a kind of a left populist politics, which should not be like the old 20th century communist left kind of a politics, but some kind of a new left politics, which will be quite aware and conscious about the current demands of the new generation, particularly the post-liberalization generation, and the vocabulary will be very new, which will be appealing. And at the same time, you have also another group called Ambedkarites and the regional populists who can linguistic diversity of India. So these three streams. But one problem in the of late has now emerged, which is that Ambedkarites, a lot of Ambedkarites, and I didn't name this in this book, but you can understand from those who were erstwhile Ambedkarites or still claim that they are Ambedkarites, whether it's RPI in Maharashtra or in you have Mayawati in BSP or Ramvilas Paswan in the party, Rojal Shakti party. They're all Ambedkarites. They all celebrate Ambedkar as a hero. They have somehow compromised with the BJP. You have this is a kind of a laid down for the progressives. So you have directly or indirectly compromised. And the crisis is that a new kind of Ambedkarite voice, whether it's Dinesh Mewani, whether it's Chandrasekhar Azad, that kind of voice is not coming up in terms of mobilizing a significant population in the northern and the western parts of India, where the BJP is really strong and the Congress is also declining, right? So this is a larger kind of a challenge. So in that context, the regional federalists, who has that kind of, whether it's DMK or Trinamool, or maybe AAP also becoming a regional party in parts of North India, with the demands of more powers to the state, demands for linguistic autonomy, demands for more financial powers to the state, all kinds of these kinds of issues can be new issues in the 21st century in India. And this is where I will call that these are some radical democratic demands, and they all they all form the part of the radical democratic agenda that can challenge both majoritarian nationalism of BJP and the communal fascism of RSS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for briefly introducing all the chapters to us. So I will request participant to pose their question in chat box, or they can unmute themselves and directly pose question to the sir.
Or I mean, they can directly ask him.
Okay, so before let me ask you few questions, a couple of questions. So a participant can put it in chat box what their questions are. So you talked about justice. Okay, so the concept of justice, as we all know, that emerged out of largely liberal tradition. So now, what are what is and now the debates of justice are going towards means more like in a Western thought for demands of recognition. The movement, social justice movements were demanding recognition in the political system, as we can say. But in India, especially in India, I'm not aware of what happening in South Asia as a whole, but especially in India, the distribution justice is largely seen. With the policy of affirmative action, and the other issues such as like environment are not covered or not debated much. So what are your thoughts and thoughts on it, and can you throw some light on it?
Yeah, so I will try to answer one by one because there is hardly any paper to write down the questions, and better for me to answer one by one instead of collecting the questions. One is that it's not true that only justice is, as far as the Western political theory is concerned, justice is only the preoccupation of the liberals. Of course, the liberals have, in a way, been more interested. Right from the 1970s, you have Rawls and Nozick, and of course, the communitarian kind of response, particularly Michael Walzer and Michael Sandel to some extent, that were there, and I will basically argue that even from the Marxist point of view, particularly J.D. Cohen and Van Parges, they were quite involved in this debate. So it's not just only the liberals who have debated. You have also strong Marxist positions on justice, and Rawls actually makes this point in his lectures on political philosophy. The book was published in 2007, I guess. So his Harvard lectures, he actually understands that for Marx, justice, capitalism is unjust. Now, and any kind of a project of communism would be a kind of a society which is beyond just. Now, in India, the tragedy is that in India, this kind of debate on what will be justice in India or justice in India, this is not very much seriously debated within the Indian political tradition. And certainly not by the Indian political theories. I don't know why, but this has not been the case. Whatever arguments for justice has emerged is more around, is kind of articulated around the ideas of social justice, affirmative action, reservation. And that can be true because of 80s, 90s, and certainly post-quantum politics. There is some kind of literature and of course political movements seeking social justice, and that tradition is long, because that tradition is actually it starts with Ambedkar, the first half of the 20th century, and certainly this tradition is long, and one could say that it is actually much longer from the 19th century onwards. You have social reformers, both in Bengal and Maharashtra, where the social justice kind of a discourse is quite old. But it is interesting that the distributive justice question is not that much strong in India. Now, one could say that why not? One would say that it is actually the state which has now taken this initiative for distributive justice. What is public distribution system? What is PDS? What is rationing? What is all these universal basic income schemes like Lokhi Bhandar in Bengal or some other kind of policies, whether it's related to health and education? These are essentially distributive justice questions. Now, one could say that, but it's at the level of state policy. Then let's say a serious discussion, what would be the distributive justice, the contents of distributive justice in India. So that has not been not been a very strong presence. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So, are there any questions from participants? So, sir, let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
Sir. You discussed the concept of demand, and the you in your chapter number 2, I guess you were discussing how demand and the post-Marxist tradition is means responding to the capitalist idea of capitalism. So what? So against this, I would like to know your opinion that what is the recent advances in the postmodern thought, especially in the South Asian context, and is there any do you see any relation in the rise of postmodern thought in political theory and the rise of majoritarianism?
Well, you see, coming from the post-Marxist point of view, you see, there is a you have to make a difference between postmodern and the post-Marxist, because the post-Marxist takes certain cues from the postmodern position. So one kind of postmodernism will be that of Baudrillard, which is like complete negation of Western modernity, which is something postmodernists do not subscribe to. Post-Marxists do not subscribe. What post-Marxists argue that the ambitions of the modern Enlightenment, okay, that is a way far more ambitious project. So we need to be a little bit cautious, and I think this has something to do with the grand failure of the Soviet project, because this was a kind of a grand project, grand meta-narrative that is something an alternative to capitalism. Now, what happened with the fall of Soviet Union? You have religious fundamentalism, which has emerged as an alternative to the liberal capitalism kind of world. But from a distance, if you look at both religious fundamentalism and liberalism, then they are already operating within the larger structure of capitalism. The fundamental structure of capitalism is still there, right? Now you don't find any alternative to the structure of capitalism, and I do not find any powerful postmodern thinkers who will challenge this kind of bottlenecks, this kind of false binary between liberalism and religious fundamentalism, or now in some parts liberal democracy versus kind of right-wing populism. Because all of them are within the structure of capitalism. But so thinking about moving beyond capitalism or thinking about the post-capitalist kind of a world order, this is where the idea of transcendence, the transformation of capitalism, the question of post-capitalist alternative is something which is there. Now I have engaged with Kojin Karadani, who is a very, very powerful Japanese thinker, who are at least thinking on that ground. Okay, so this is something which and this is one of my complaint towards Sen also, because this is something he is not moving beyond that. It's something kind of caught up within the structure of capitalism, and that's why his capabilities approach completely fits with this also with the realization focus comparison, that he is interested in removing injustices. Then let's say moving beyond a kind of alternative that we need to think about. So this is where whatever postmodern thinkers are today, we get, when we were kids, like when we were in university, we all used to get excited with a lot of postmodern writings here and there, and we can read and cite them, whatever. But while doing my political theory kind of research in England, and later while teaching, I I'm quite convinced that postmodernism has no answer today, because that scene is over. Whatever arms and ammunition they have actually gave, and this is another kind of Marxist kind of a argument that a lot of religious fundamentalism have actually used the arms and ammunition provided by postmodernism. So the issue of authenticity, the issue of locality, difference, all those things that actually today you have the religious fundamentalists have actually used that. I can give you one example. So you have Gopi Said, who had written a very theoretically sophisticated book called A Fundamental Fear, Eurocentrism and the Emergence of Islamism. He was a Lucknow student. He did his PhD in Essex. But if you read that book, then it is essentially a celebration of Islamism, a very uncritical celebration of Islam. You see. And there might be several others who will celebrate from a postmodern approach. There will be others who might celebrate a kind of a Zionist state or a Hindu Rashtra kind of thing. I'm not aware of that kind of literature, but this is something which is a kind of poverty of let's say postmodernism today. So after 9/11 and after the 2008 financial crisis, the world is pretty much clear now. You have to take positions now. You can't say that, okay, well, in the name of ambiguity and all, you just you can negotiate. I won't say anything to this kind of a to the kind of a problems that has been created by this world order. That is, I think, it will be a more of an escapist position, and a lot of postmoderns actually opt for this escapist position. The post-Marxists are not. Post-Marxists have a clear agenda. They think they are clear that we need to move beyond capitalism, but at the same time very cautious that whatever the name you have given, so whether it is in Piketty's social state of the 21st century, and he of course uses a lot, extends that particular idea in his new book Capital and Ideology, where when he's of course engaging with both with Rawls and Rawls and with Marx, but whatever the name that you give, post-Marxists will say that it will be still temporary. So even if you have a post-capitalist alternative, which is like communism, but then the communism will be still temporary, because we have already learned that mistake in celebrating the Soviet socialism model. So we think, and politics is something which is an ever-going process. So it will never. There is no end of politics. Politics will always go on, because antagonism, which is something, a limit of all objectivity, is constitutive of human society. So there cannot be any harmonious society that things will be all fine and we will all living in heaven. No, there is no heaven in this world. There is no heaven. This practical reality. The realities could be harsh. The realities could be a little better, but there are multiple realities. And post-Marxists will say that, okay, even we have this agenda for moving beyond capitalism, and that will be very good. Even if we don't have moving beyond capitalism, even if we have welfare capitalism, that's also fine. But things have to be continuously. We need to struggle for a better world. So political struggle for a better world is something which is very much the crux of the post-Marxist position. But this is not a position of a lot of postmoderns. You see, so post-Marxists are intelligent enough to think that there is no final horizon, that there is no final heavenly-like harmonious world where every problem of the world will be solved. Fundamentalists do think that. Fundamentalists think that if you have Hindu Rashtra, if you have Islamic State, things will be all solved. Everything will be resolved. The Marxists think that. Marxists think that with communism, things will be all resolved, right? Liberals think that. Liberals think that if you have a completely market society, then everything will be taken care of the market. Post-Marxists are not like that. Post-Marxists have a difference with all of these ideological positions. Post-Marxists will say that, you see, there cannot be any total resolution of human problems. You see, because there will be always kind of antagonism and the struggle for hegemony. So we are cautious for that. So we are pragmatic, at the same time we are cautious. We know the limits of all this project.
Thank you, sir, for that elaborate answer. So I would request Dr. Kulkarni to make some remark.
Yeah, I think we have had a very instructive and a very wide-ranging kind of presentation from Dr. Maidul Islam, as was to be expected, because at least I know, and some of us also know by now, some others too here, because this is his second visit to the department, and last time, in fact, he gave 2 or 3 lectures. So many of us are aware of the range of his engagements, theoretical and practical political engagements. And it's really very heartening to note that he has actually put together his writings on this wide range of concerns, and which he has sifted through or analyzed through the kind of complex theoretical lens which he brings to bear upon all his work, which he now has characterized as a form of post-Marxism, deriving inspiration from the work of Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau and other similar thinkers. So, and I'm particularly glad that now, you see, in the 21st century, in the last decade or so, we have been witnessing here in India and from or out of India the publication of works which are theoretical. They are books on political theory, but which are not mere commentaries on work done in the West, or which are not just digests or summaries of work done elsewhere, but these are now a real sort of original interventions in the larger sphere, the global sphere of political theory, the global universe of discourse in political theory. And these interventions are, moreover, not narrowly indigenous, etc. Because that also is something we have been hearing about for a long time. But these are now far more confident and far more cosmopolitan. They're not defensive. They're not inward-looking, but they engage with actually wide range of discourses, be they quote-unquote indigenous or be they quote-unquote European, etc. That doesn't really matter now. Doesn't matter in the sense that, of course, these locations are important and they are taken into account and they are properly theorized. But that is the labor of politics. That's the task of political theory. And that is a proper task. And I think through these interventions now, finally, Indian scholarship in political theory is truly making a mark at the global level, and we are becoming true dialogue partners in this particular universe of discourse in political theory. And that is how I see Dr. Maidul Islam's work. And I do hope that it will get the attention that it deserves. And perhaps some of us here who are participating in this discussion will also respond to his book in print and in other ways. Because there is another tendency which I have seen in the last 10 years, and that is a number of good books are being published. Routledge, for example, his own publisher, and I think I've also published with them. Yeah, I have a book on global masculinities with them, an edited volume. What happens is that sometimes, these books just vanish. I don't know why it happens. There was a time when each such book used to get much wider coverage. But perhaps there are many more good books being published, and of course, people have very short attention span, and I do not know what it is, but this also has been happening, and I do hope that Dr. Islam's book will escape that fate. So with these words, I once again thank him and thank Akshay Chowdhury and Sriranjan Aute, who have facilitated this program and the series of lectures that we have been having. And I also thank the participants, though I wish they had been a little more vocal. So, okay, with those words, we come to the end of this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, once again. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We can leave now, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.